I recently picked up this Sega collection for the Commodore 64. I figured I like Sega and I like Commodore, so what could possibly go wrong? Plus, as it points out here, it's a $169 value. Yeah. It comes in this enormous box, but once you crack it open, you'll find not much space is used, especially not for what's probably the flimsiest excuse for a manual I've ever seen. The games are spread across several floppies, and today we're going to be reviewing OutRun. Specifically, we're going to be comparing this OutRun to the OutRun you find on Sega's own 8-bit console, the Sega Master System. Now, it says 2 mega on the front, but don't let that fool you. They crammed this whole thing into 256K, so that's megabits, not megabytes. Though it's worth noting that that's still bigger than this Commodore edition. And that's the one we're going to start off with, the good old Commodore 64. And as you can see here, you select the route ahead of time, unlike the arcade OutRun, which actually branches. And you select your music just like the arcade, although in this one, there are only 2 tracks to choose from. That works for me because those are my 2 favorites. Now, one thing you can immediately see is one of the game's biggest shortcomings. That is, the dirt or grass or whatever is the same color as the road, and I don't know why this is. I think it's the only game on the Commodore that does this, and it looks more like something off the good old Atari than off the Commodore 64. Not only that, but when you turn the road kind of scrolls left and right, it doesn't really move in perspective. So when you're on kind of the right side of the road as I am now, it kind of looks like you're perpetually about to crash into the side of the road. But looking past these issues, the game actually does play a great deal like arcade OutRun. In fact, I find that this game captures a lot of the sense of speed that I would expect from a good port. Not only that, but the cornering feels like OutRun as well. So this game has it where it counts in the gameplay department, even though the graphics are, they took some shortcuts there. Now, if you're a Commodore fan, you might be asking, how does this stack up to other arcade racers on that platform? Well, comparing it to something like Super Cycle, I think that this controls quite a bit better, and it has a really good soundtrack. In fact, the rendition of the OutRun soundtrack on the Commodore is one of my favorite renditions of that score. And I don't know if you can really see it in the YouTube video here, but the game moves along at full frame rate, even if the roadside objects and cars don't quite do that. The stripes on the road and the scrolling are all moving at 60 frames a second. Also, if you take a look at the background in the very distance, you'll see a little bit of parallax, which was fairly uncommon at the time on this platform. One minor gripe I do have is that in all the other versions of OutRun, if you rear end another vehicle, you drift a little bit to one side, which means you really don't want to hit them because you could very well skid off the road. In this version, you just slow down a little bit, which isn't to say that this version is any easier. In fact, I found it to be one of the harder ports of OutRun. And rest assured, all the other collision animations are present in this game. One gripe about the music I do have is that this solo in Magical Sound Shower is somehow missing. And as you can hear, it just transposes it up a notch. And maybe this was a memory constraint thing, but I would have enjoyed it if they had at least attempted a solo, even if it's a different solo. You also don't get the high score music, though you do get the crashing waves. And of course it has the map screen and shows you how close you were to the checkpoint when you game overed. And yeah, it's always right around the corner. Damn it. Okay, and we're on to the Master System version of OutRun. Is it going to destroy the Commodore version? I mean, after all, it is Sega's very own console. Now, as you can see here, you get all 3 soundtracks from the arcade version of OutRun. So we're off to a really good start. Getting into the game, you can see immediately that the road is road colored, the sand is sand colored, and everything is higher res. But the frame rate is quite a bit lower than on the Commodore edition. And gone is that really nice parallax from the Commodore edition, though for your frame rate and parallax sacrifices, you do get much more detailed graphics with a much better palette. Now, obviously, the Master System sound chip is nowhere close to the Commodore SID. So, you know, gone is that phasing, and there's not much bass in this mix. But despite that, they did a pretty respectable rendition of these themes. And if you have the Japanese Master System or something with an FM chip, you can enjoy these songs in full FM glory. And did you see that? When I hit a car, I skid sideways, which is exactly what you want. Now, this game is a bit more forgiving than the Commodore one despite that. I also like that it has the branching roads, which was a huge omission from the Commodore version of the game. The Commodore one does have most of the levels, but like we saw before, you know, in that one you pick your route from the map screen before you start the race. And I could be wrong, but I believe it's the sole version of OutRun that doesn't have branching paths. But speaking of shortcomings that no other version of OutRun has, the Sega version of OutRun locks your perspective to the middle of the screen and then starts moving the car left and right instead of moving the road left and right, and it's very disorienting and looks a bit cheap. It's a bit of a weird decision and makes it feel like they just didn't have the time to finish their effect. And you've got to hand it to these guys, the solo from Magical Sound Shower here is full of clashing notes, but at least they attempted it. And the Commodore one didn't even try, which is too bad because other than that, it's a really good version of the OutRun soundtrack. Oh my god, the sound chip is so shrill, I just kind of want to tear my eardrums out. I am taking the same path and selecting the same music in both playthroughs so you can kind of compare the two. Now, let's talk about the controls. The steering works great. It works as well as the Commodore one or the arcade one. Nothing to complain about there. However, this version uses up on the control pad to shift to low gear and down to shift to high gear. And the upshot of that is you'll be accidentally throwing this car into low gear by accident over and over again because the control pad is that sensitive. The Commodore one only has one button, but you know, on that one, up speeds up, down hits the brakes, and the button toggles gears. They really could have used a button on this one to toggle the gear shift instead, and that would have completely avoided any of these issues. It's also worth mentioning that there are other 8-bit versions of OutRun. There's a Game Gear one actually, which plays more like an OutRun sequel, which is quite good. There's a TurboGrafx version, and you know, that has an 8-bit processor if you want to count that. That's an excellent version. And if you're not hung up on playing it on an 8-bit system, I should recommend the Saturn version because that has some hidden options that no other version of OutRun has. You know, you can actually set that one in a 60 frames a second mode or play it in 30 like the arcade is. And you can use it with the Saturn wheel, which feels really good. It's pretty much arcade perfect. And so if you really want the definitive version of OutRun, get that one. So finally here we have the high score music. Very sentimental. So anyway, yeah, if you're gonna get an 8-bit version of OutRun and you're left having to choose between the Commodore 64 or this edition on Sega's very own 8-bit console, well, it really depends on what you can live with and live without. I really like the Commodore's sense of speed, the phased out SID soundtrack rendition, and I don't mind the missing elements from the Commodore edition as much as I miss the sensation of speed when I play the SMS version. So for me, it's Commodore all the way. Thanks for watching.